the experience at Princeton Seminary, which could be probably multiplied many times. This has been documented by Presbyterian scholars. Charles Hodge was an old earther. Early in his life, he favored the gap theory, but by about 1860, he switched over to the day-age view. He was adamantly anti-evolution. He wrote a book, What is Darwinism? And he concluded correctly that it was atheism. But he was compromised on the millions of years, and he said it didn't matter. The age of the earth wasn't important. He was replaced at Princeton by his son, A.A. Hodge. A.A. Hodge began to toy with the idea of theistic evolution. Maybe God used evolution to create the world. A.A. Hodge was replaced by B.B. Warfield, who really took on theistic evolution and even went so far as to postulate that perhaps even the account of the origin of Adam and Eve could be harmonized with human evolution. His big concern was simply to not remove the idea of divine providence from the whole thing, but he was pretty well accepting of the idea of theistic evolution. Well, B.B. Warfield died in 1921, and he was still orthodox in defending the great truths of the Christian faith, including the inerrancy of Scripture, but Princeton went downhill very, very rapidly from there. And one of the students who attended there in the 40s was a man named Charles Templeton. Most of you have probably heard of him, but he was a great evangelist. He was a contemporary of Billy Graham. They were both about the same age, and many people considered him to be potentially even a greater evangelist than Billy Graham. He preached to thousands, not only in the United States, but other countries. Ken Ham spoke at a church in Edinburgh a couple of years ago, and a man in his 90s came up to Ken after he preached, and Ken even mentioned Charles Templeton, and this man said, Ken, I want you to know that I came to Christ under the preaching of Charles Templeton in this very pulpit where you've spoken tonight. But Charles Templeton died, and just before he died, his book, Farewell to God, was published, in which he gave his reasons for rejecting the Christian faith. And he said this in the book: I believe that there is no supreme being with human attributes, no God in the biblical sense, but that life is the result of timeless evolutionary forces having reached its present transient state over millions of years. He went to Princeton in the 1940s. By then it was very liberal. His seminary professors were reinforcing evolution in millions of years. And so his faith was destroyed by this teaching. But Princeton's not the only place. So he passed into apostasy. Most of the Christian colleges, evangelical colleges, and seminaries, one of which I attended, most of them are denying the literal truth of Genesis 1 to 11, with all kinds of compromised positions. But I want to read to you now an email that I got from one of the leading evangelical theologians just a few weeks ago. I've been in private email correspondence with him. I highly respect him. I've benefited much from his writings. But it illustrates to me where we're at, especially in evangelical theological circles and academia, and it's something that just grieves my heart, but I think it's very revealing. But he said this: as you might suspect, Terry, I still do not see differences over the age of the earth as very significant to the Christian life or to any other doctrines. Hundreds and hundreds of competent biblical interpreters hold to an old earth and don't deny inerrancy. Well, they don't deny inerrancy explicitly, but folks, we can deny inerrancy implicitly, unconsciously, unintentionally. We can deny it even as we pound the table insisting that we do believe in inerrancy. We can deny it by our behavior. We can deny it by our beliefs, even though we passionately are insisting and signing the doctrinal statement that we believe in inerrancy. And the fact that hundreds and hundreds of competent biblical interpreters hold to the old earth view and don't interpret inerrancy just means that hundreds and hundreds of competent biblical scholars are wrong. And I can say that because if the old earthers are right, then 18 centuries of hundreds and hundreds of competent biblical scholars who held to a young earth and inerrancy are wrong. So either way, you can't escape this terribly uncomfortable conclusion that hundreds and hundreds of competent biblical scholars are wrong. You can't avoid the conclusion. But truth isn't determined by majority vote anyway. And if we're going to, then we should go with the 18 centuries of Christian testimony rather than the last 200 years of scholarship. But he goes on. While I see many specific texts that clearly and explicitly teach male headship in the home and in the church, I see no text of Scripture that requires us to believe in a young earth. And I wrote back to him and I said, what about Genesis 1? And yom used with a number and used with evening and morning and defined literally. And what about Exodus 20 verse 11? And what about Mark 10:6, that Jesus said Adam and Eve were at the beginning of creation, not billions of years after the beginning? He said, it just doesn't seem to me to be something that God thought it important to give us teaching about in His Word. And I say this after about 50 years of reading the Bible. That kind of thinking is typical among evangelical scholars today. Very typical. And it's sad. But why? How can he not see it? The reason he can't see it is because he is living in a stream of 150 years of Christian theological compromise with the idea of millions of years. So let me illustrate it this way. Back in the early 19th century, the church was saying, come to Jesus, come to the cross and be saved. And in the early 19th century, deists and atheists launched a missile attacking the foundations of the Christian faith with the idea of millions of years, untold ages, rejecting the biblical chronology, rejecting the biblical flood, rejecting the biblical account of creation. And it landed, and the church said, that's a side issue. It didn't hit the cross. It doesn't matter. I'm pretty sure, I'm expectant that I will see William Buckland and Adam Sedgwick in heaven. I'm sure that they believed the gospel. I'm sure that they believed that Jesus died for their sins. But they were part of that attack. If they had attacked the cross, the church would have risen up in arms. But they didn't. Those enemies of the gospel attacked the foundation. And Buckland and Sedgwick said, it's a side issue. It doesn't matter. And both of them said that the Bible could be harmonized with these geological theories of an old earth, but in their whole lives, they never gave an explanation of how you could harmonize the Bible with millions of years. They just asserted that they weren't contradictory. And because of their ecclesiastical authority, they influenced the church. But if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? And over the next 150 years, the assault just continued at an increasing pace. And the enemies of the gospel knew that what they were doing. I could give you quotes of Charles Lyell writing privately to one of his old earth buddies saying, we're gonna dupe all of these bishops and clergy. If we just handle this strategy right, they'll come right along with us. He knew exactly what he was doing. And the church said it didn't hit the cross, it doesn't matter. But if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? And over the next 150 years, there became more and more unbelief in our culture. There became more and more unbelief in the church. Christian theologians, respected pastors, were making a distinction and just focusing on the New Testament. And the enemies of the gospel just continued to hammer away up to this present time. And so that's why Answers in Genesis exists. That's why we are training people to understand and believe that the Bible is true from the very first verse. And they love the Lord, but those 200 years of scholars and pastors and Christian leaders were not faithful to Genesis. And it hurt the church.